Philosophy means the love of wisdom. It began in Ionia, which is the western coast of Asia Minor, what is now Turkey, and it began in a world where the climate was warm and people went outside and they began to exchange ideas and they began to exchange thoughts in a society that was free, in a society where people were important and people's ideas counted and they felt the freedom to exchange ideas. And philosophy began as a search for the answers to the questions of life. But the answers were found by relying upon men's thinking, their reason, their opinions, and not upon any absolute standard. Some people believe that philosophy began in Ionia as a reaction to religion, against religion, and point out that the religion against which they were reacting was the pagan religion of the Greeks, and it was a religion that was interpreted by priests, that these priests were in league with the nobility, and they often used their power of supposedly knowing things from the gods that people didn't know to oppress the people. And that it was a reaction of people declaring their independence from that kind of spiritual tyranny. At least that's the view of J.B. Bury, one of the great historians of Greek history. Early philosophy, which begins in the 6th century B.C., had two strains of thought that were very different, but they were combined originally. There are two ways to approach life. So look at the physical aspects of life and look at the metaphysical aspects of life. Metaphysical meaning spiritual. Now, in the beginning, the philosophers were interested in all of this, every realm of knowledge. And they made no distinction between the spiritual and the physical. They were simply looking for answers. Now later, those two streams of philosophy will separate. But let's go back and kind of trace the beginning of philosophy. The first philosopher was a man named Thales from Miletus. Miletus was the leading city in the early Hellenic period. It was a big city. It was a very important city. They established 45 colonies. Great scholars were in Miletus. Thales was, in one sense, a political philosopher, in that he was trying to unite Ionia into a common hall of assembly. He believed that the Greeks should unite and not just be divided up into little city-states, but they would come together and thus, in that unity, protect themselves against the Persians. But also he was a scientific philosopher. We might say an astronomer. He predicted a solar eclipse on one occasion. He accurately predicted this eclipse. And the historian Herodotus tells us that the Lydians called off a battle on that day because they believed Thales' prediction. Called off a battle that was scheduled for that day. But perhaps he's most well known for what I might call his ontological philosophy. And by ontological we mean being. What is being? What is reality? And he was looking for the common denominator of life. What is common to all of life? Well, his answer was water. Water is in all living substances. It's the common denominator. So obviously Thales was looking at something very physical. But Thales just started a process, and then there were other philosophers that came along, like Anaximander in the 6th century. And he said, no, it's not water. It's something more than that. It's the unlimited. Well, now, Anaximander meant by the unlimited something that was actually physical in nature, but it was not limited by any type of structure. It could change shapes. So everything that exists is from this unlimited substance, this kind of basic element of all of life that just takes different shapes and appears as different things. But then along came Xenophanes from Colophon, 6th century. And he said, no, it's not the unlimited, it's God. Well, that sounds spiritual. But actually, he thought of God as a physical being that inhabited space and could be defined, It wasn't quite the view of God. This is a view of God based on human reasons, not of God revealed in Scripture. And then Heraclitus from Ephesus, also in Asia Minor. Ephesus was just beginning to be important. in the 5th century. And Heraclitus said, no, the common thing, the common denominator of life is change. Everything changes. He called it the doctrine of the flux. It's always changing. We are changing. We're different today from what we were yesterday. You put your hand or your foot in the water, in a stream of water, and that water is flowing. It's a different water that's flowing through that stream. Everything changes. Parmenides of Elea in the 5th century said, the common denominator of life is an eternal, unchanging being. An eternal, unchanging being. He's getting awfully close, isn't he, to a view of God. Anaxagoras from Ionia in the 5th century said, the common denominator of life is a perpetual motion. Motion. And Empedocles of Sicily, interesting, that's far west, south of Italy, the island of Sicily. And that's a Greek area. And there was a lot of Greek scholars in the west section of Greece, the Western Greeks in Sicily and South Italy. Empedocles said, no, I'll tell you what it is. It's 4 elements. It is fire, water, air, and earth. So he's back to the physical, you see. And he also believed in a kind of theory of evolution, the survival of the fittest. And he believed that the world operates by a doctrine of attraction and repulsion, kind of like if you turn 2 magnets one way, they'll attract to each other, and you turn the other way and they repulse each other. Then there was Protagoras of Abdera up in the north part of Greece in the 5th century, who said, man is the measure of all things. There's the definition of the humanistic idea we'll talk about next time. Man is the measure of all things. And he also believed in the doctrine of relativity, long before Einstein. Leucippus and Democritus in the 5th century had postulated that everything is made up of atoms, the atomic theory. I said, well, they were accurate, weren't they? But this was something they figured out by reason then, the atomic theory. And Gorgias of Sicily spoke of being, but not necessarily eternal, unchangeable, but an unknowable being. So if you look at these philosophers, clearly we have 2 lines, the physical and the metaphysical. Philosophy begins to reach its culmination point as we come into the latter part of the 5th century and into the 4th century. With Socrates, born about 469, died in 399. By the way, he was put to death by the Athenian government for having a bad influence on the youth, for corrupting the youth of Athens by making them think too deeply. He was an Athenian of modest means. He had a family when he was an older person. He died at 70, but he had teenage sons. So obviously he was an older person when he had his family. He never left Athens except to fight in the Peloponnesian War, and he fought bravely. He was a hero at the Battle of Delium in 420 and saved his friend Alcibiades. We know nothing of his education, very little at all about Socrates, except what is written by his devoted pupil Plato. Plato tells us about Socrates more than anybody else. Evidently, from the statues that have been made of him, the busts that have been made of him, he was rather ugly. He had a satyr-like face and a bulbous nose. The main purpose of Socrates was to achieve moral perfection by submitting false and obscure ideas to critical discussion, by interrogating his fellow citizens. I mean, he asked questions all the time. What about this? What about this? What about this? He made people think. What do you think about this? And then when they said what they thought, he showed them how that was faulty. But he felt his task passionately. He said, I am like a gadfly on the collective rump of Athens. I sting and I bite these Athenians, and I make them think, and they don't like to think. He wandered around the marketplaces and into the gymnasia, that's the exercise grounds, and he would find anybody he could to engage in argument, particularly the young men who were working out in the gymnasia. And that's why he was accused of subverting the youth of Athens. Very unpopular with the masses. Very subversive to local patriotism. His ideas were insidious to the social fabric of the state. He was upsetting things. And they put him to death, eventually. The Democrats thought him to be a dangerous free thinker. You would be surprised if I tell you that the Athenian democracy actually was not all that free. Because these Democrats, once they got in power, tended to be very, very intolerant of anyone who challenged their views. And they called attention to his pupils, Plato, Alcibiades, Critias, and Xenophon. I can't tell you the story of all these people, but I can say all of them were nonconformists. Socrates was considered to be the first champion of the supremacy of the human intellect. He believed man must order his life by his own intellect. He believed in the sovereignty of human understanding. And in order to achieve his goals, he insisted on definition. He said that's the only way to safeguard against errors. So when he's talking to somebody, what do you mean by that? Define your terms. Define what you are saying. And as soon as you defined it, he would show you where your argument wouldn't stand up. Now, when they finally asked him at his trial why he did what he did, and by the way, we do have his trial, the Greeks, when they were on trial, they had to defend themselves. They could not have a lawyer defending them. They could have some preparation ahead of time, though Socrates didn't. But when they got up to defend themselves, they had to speak for themselves. And in the Apology of Socrates, which is written by Plato, he said, the reason I ask these people, particularly the young people, to defend their beliefs is this. I once went to the Delphic oracle, and I asked the oracle who was the wisest man in the world. And the oracle said, you are, Socrates. You're the wisest man in the world. And Socrates said, I knew that couldn't be true because I don't know anything. And I know I'm not wise. So what I will do is prove the Delphic oracle wrong. I will find somebody who is wiser than I am. And I'm going around looking for somebody that's wiser than I am, and I haven't found anybody yet. Because there's nobody who can answer the questions and defend what he believes and make sense and present an argument that holds water. I can't find anybody that's wiser than I am, and I know I don't have any wisdom. He was the founder of ethical utilitarianism. To Socrates, what is good is what is useful. Virtue was happiness, personal well-being. He taught that no man would willingly do wrong. The only reason that people would do anything wrong is through ignorance, because nobody would will his own unhappiness. And knowledge means you'll be happy. He was accused of being an atheist, because he did not accept the traditional religion. So I'm not an atheist, but I am an agnostic regarding the divine principle and the immortality of the soul. But he said, I do believe in divine activity, so I can't be an atheist. And he said there was one kind of divine activity that affected him. He called it his genius. And it was like a little voice. And he said, my genius will stop me if I'm on the wrong track. If I start to say something false, it's kind of like a conscience or something, waving a flag. It's going to stop me. And as long as my genius doesn't stop me, I know I'm okay. I'm speaking the truth. I'm saying what I should say. But if my genius stops me, then I know that I need to quit. He believed in that. He was the unsparing critic of all things. He never really preached. He only discussed and asked questions. But he imparted a spirit of criticism and skepticism and intellectual courage and freedom. He proved that popular notions were inconsistent, and he wanted to convince every young man that his convictions could not stand up under examination. Socrates was put to death in 399. Plato loved his teacher dearly and continued his tradition. Plato was born about 427, died in 347. He was born either at Athens or at Aegina, the island that's off the coast of Athens. He started out to be a poet, but Plato came under Socrates' influence. And he came to believe that reality lay in the ideal world. Reality was not in the physical, but in the realm of what he called the forms, the ideas, the ideals. The material is but a shadow of the real thing. I'm seeing a chair in front of me right now, several chairs. Plato would say, that chair is not the real thing. What is real is the idea of chair in your mind. And when you see and perceive this physical object, it corresponds to your idea of a chair in your mind. And then you can identify that as a chair. But what is real is the idea, because the idea doesn't change. You could take something and destroy that physical thing. And so it's not real. Something that's real cannot be destroyed. Now, in my mind is the idea of beauty. So I see a rose. I identify that as a beautiful object because it corresponds to my idea of beauty. My idea of beauty doesn't change, nor my idea of truth, or justice, or goodness. These are real ideas, and they come from God. and the physical things simply correspond to them. That was Plato's view. So he did believe in God. He believed that everything came from God, and that God established universal truth. God is the one. He's the great unity. God is the good, the ultimate good. His ideas are best expressed in his dialogue, The Republic. Plato's philosophy, though, was always tied, as was Aristotle's, to the city-state, the Greek city-state, the polis, which we discussed in our last lecture. Hence, it is, in a sense, a political philosophy. He is seeking an ideal society, and the individual's life has meaning as he participates in the city, never apart from the city. Plato's ideas are perhaps best expressed in his famous allegory of the cave. And in this allegory, he has a cave, he sees a cave, and there are people in this cave who are chained to their seats, and their heads are chained where they cannot turn. And they're facing the back wall of the cave. Behind them, there's a fire. And there are men and animals walking in front of the fire, between the opening of the cave and the fire, so that the light is projecting the shadows of these men and animals on the back wall of the cave. Then someone comes along and cuts loose their chains from their neck so they can turn around and actually see those men and animals at the mouth of the cave. Finally, one of these people is released to go out into the sunlight and live among the real men and animals outside. And he says, that's the way we are. In our ignorance, we're chained, and we only see shadows. In our ignorance, we only see the material world, and it's just the shadows. But when we become enlightened through philosophy, we can turn around and actually see the reality. But a few people can be unchained and go out into the world of ideas and just live in the world of ideas. These people then will come back to the cave to teach others, and that was the philosopher. The philosopher is one who lives in the realm of the ideas, who lives in the realm of the forms. He had, by the way, an experiment with a man named Dionysius of Syracuse, a leader of a city in Sicily. He was trying to create a true philosopher king out of him, who would be such a philosopher who would guide his city-state into an understanding of reality. That didn't work. He went back to Athens. Some people say it didn't work because he put poor old Dionysius through too much education. He finally got worn out with it. But he went back to Athens to establish a school called the Academy, the Platonic Academy in Athens. That academy lasted for about 800 or 900 years. Very famous school. His thinking was the cornerstone of Western philosophic tradition and the basis for thinking throughout the medieval period. And it became the framework for Christian thought for about 500 years. I think you can see why. God, absolute truth, all coming from God. I believe it was Immanuel Kant who said, after Plato, all philosophy is a series of footnotes. In other words, you either agree with Plato or you disagree with Plato. We will distinguish Platonism from Neoplatonism, which comes later. That was a religion and was in competition with Christianity in the early days of the church. Aristotle was the pupil of Plato. Born in 384, died in 322, probably at Stagira in Ionia. He came from a family of medical doctors. About 335, he established the Lyceum, the rival school at Athens, also lasting for 800 or 900 years. His father was court physician to King Philip II of Macedon. And Aristotle was, for that reason, invited to be the tutor to Philip's son, the crown prince, Alexander the Great. But there was never any philosophic lasting influence on Alexander. Aristotle came to disagree with his teacher, perhaps due to his medical and scientific influence, and he believed that reality begins with the material. He started with the material world that Plato rejected. He believed in inductive reasoning, whereas Plato believes in deductive. In other words, you take these material things and you observe all these categories and you form generalizations, and scientifically you work upward and upward and upward, and finally you get to God. So Plato summed up the metaphysical philosophies, and Aristotle summed up the physical philosophies. Plato was a mystic. Aristotle was a scientist. And to Aristotle, all of knowledge was his province. He wrote on natural history, anatomy, psychology, philosophy, physics, logic, metaphysics, meteorology, aesthetics, and ethics. Plato looked for the ideal state, or the ideal anything. Aristotle for the most probable. Plato stressed unity. Aristotle stressed diversity and plurality. Plato believed in absolutes. Aristotle said all truth and morals are relative to the situation. We call that today situation ethics. Both believed that the study of man is the prime concern of philosophy, so both were humanists. Both assumed that man found meaning in life in active participation in the city-state, the polis. Aristotle said man is a political animal. Aristotle believed in the natural, intricate mechanics of being. He observed similarities in a multitude of particular things, and he classified them into higher and higher categories, generalizations. But he saw an order in all of these things. And he said God is the ultimate generalization that contains all of the rest. All being has potential and is in a constant process of fulfillment. That's the end of all activity, like the potential of a baby is to grow. The cause and purpose is the process of realizing your potential. He assumed the whole universe was good, and the universe was in a constant dynamic process of fulfillment, of becoming. And God is the prime mover who got all this started. He's the uncaused first cause. He's the cause of everything. God is the force who has no potential. He's pure form. He's completely realized. Man in this system is a creature of body, and as such is subject to the same general pattern of development as all nature is. His physical potential is realized through growth. But he's more. Man is more than a physical being. He has a soul, said Aristotle. And the soul's potential is for good. And as this meaningful universe, this is a very optimistic philosophy, as this meaningful universe moves from worse to better, the soul is the faculty in man which enables him to understand its progress and is oriented toward goodness. Man's end, both physically and spiritually, is the enjoyment of the good life. But that in the context of the city-state, the polis. And Aristotle said, man can attain the highest good only in the state, which is the highest of all, and which embraces all the rest, and aims at good in a greater degree than any other, and at the highest good. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. And then we come into later on in the 4th century, and the Hellenistic period, and the time of Alexander, and the polis passes away. And the city-state is gone, and we have these great states, like we talked about last time. And in that context, two great philosophies, among others, emerge. One is the philosophy of Zeno. And Zeno, who is the founder of what we call the Stoic philosophy, because he taught on the porch, the Stoas, saw the universe as deterministic and believed in a kind of a fatalism. Everything is going to be the way it's going to be. Even gods are subject to this fatalistic agenda. And since the universe is determined, and there's no intelligent purpose in it, no intelligent God in Stoicism, no love in it, no salvation in it, but man's highest good is pleasure. And so he needs to determine the flow of things. He needs to determine the purpose of his life and fulfill his duty. The Roman soldiers loved that. They loved the emphasis on duty. So Stoicism was very popular with the Romans. And so it's a personal thing. Achieve pleasure. Now, on the other hand, there was Epicurus, also during the Hellenistic period, also with a very individualized philosophy. Now, different from this deterministic view of Zeno, Epicurus believed in free will, so to speak. There is nothing determined. It's all open. He believed in the atomic theory. He picked that up from Leucippus and Democritus. But he said, as the atoms come down, they swerve. They make a swerve that enables man to have free choice. If they didn't, he wouldn't. They swerve. And he believed also that man's highest good is pleasure, like Zeno. But whereas Zeno said, you must do your duty, because everything is determined and you find out what it is and you go along with it, Epicurus said, man's highest good is pleasure, so he has to figure out, using his free will, that the thing that causes you not to have pleasure is pain, and you must avoid pain at all costs. Anything that's painful, you avoid it. And one of the most painful things is religion. That can be very perplexing and very troublesome, so by all means, avoid religion. Avoid the gods, because the gods cause you pain. Now, it's interesting that it is these two philosophies that Paul debated in the marketplace at Athens. You read about in Acts 17. Our conclusion. Philosophy attempted to provide a means by which man could determine the meaning of life and the purpose of human existence, and the proper way of living and achieving that purpose through his own reason, unaided by any kind of divine revelation. Philosophy is a manifestation of a humanistic worldview, whereas Hellenic philosophy emphasized man's role in the context of society, interdependent on other citizens, and seeking the good of the entire community. Hellenistic philosophy, reflecting the magnitude of society and its impersonal nature, emphasized the individual and his achieving his own personal pleasure. Philosophy has no absolute standard other than that which the philosopher arbitrarily imposes. Thus, philosophies differed as fundamental premises differed, resulting in a variety of conclusions. Each philosophy, however, tried to be logical, reasoning from its presuppositions in an orderly and consistent manner. Greek philosophy was fundamentally opposed to the Hebrew mentality, which assumed the existence of an omnipotent and omniscient God who alone determined the purpose of human existence and the proper means of living, and who spoke authoritatively through his word. Now, this tension was summed up by the early Christian writer Tertullian in his famous question, "What does Jerusalem have to do with Athens?" Where Greek philosophy was most heavily entrenched in the East, Christianity often accommodated itself to philosophic methods and used human reason to determine conclusions. Christianity has continued to struggle in an ongoing tension between a philosophic and a theological approach to God and human existence, between relying on the infallible Word of God and relying on human reason. Paul actually lay the matter to rest in his statement in 1 Corinthians 1, where he said, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the intelligence of the intelligent I will frustrate. Where is the wise man? Where is the scholar? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe."